1. A property law professor asks students to resolve a boundary dispute involving overlapping deeds. What learning method best supports critical thinking? A. Role-play mediation. B. Multiple choice quiz. C. Flashcard drill. D. Legal term matching. 2. In a clinical setting, students draft a complaint over an encroachment issue. This best supports A. Legal writing skills. B. Visual learning. C. Memorization techniques. D. Statute recall. 3. A student in a land use seminar evaluates a zoning ordinance's constitutionality. Which doctrine should the instructor emphasize? A. Police power. B. Privity of contract. C. Marketable title. D. Constructive eviction. 4. An instructor mentors students on restrictive covenants using real HOA disputes. This method emphasizes A. Experiential learning. B. Passive recall. C. Memorization. D. Uniform testing. 5. In assessing a tenant's claim of constructive eviction, which factor is most relevant? A. Habitability standards. B. Zoning variance. C. Title search. D. Easement rights. 6. A professor facilitates peer critique of draft easement agreements. This method promotes A. Collaborative analysis. B. Doctrinal isolation. C. Passive compliance. D. Top-down instruction. 7. In a title defect clinic, students research adverse possession. Which element must be emphasized? A. Continuous and hostile possession. B. Color of title. C. Easement appurtenant. D. Quiet title. 8. A real property mentor assigns students to simulate a deed transfer. This develops A. Transactional fluency. B. Doctrinal rigidity. C. Case recall only. D. Recitation ability. 9. To assess understanding of mortgage priority, instructors should require students to A. Construct a lien timeline. B. Recite cases. C. Memorize statutes. D. List mortgage types. 10. A professor uses a neighborhood plot map to teach boundary law. This supports which adult learning principle? A. Visual spatial engagement. B. Rote memorization. C. Passive reading. D. Sequential listing. 11. When teaching tenancy by the entirety, instructors must clarify A. Unity of marriage and survivorship. B. Possession and profit. C. Easement dominance. D. License revocation. 12. A clinic student advises a client on subletting under a commercial lease. The mentor should assess the student's A. Understanding of privity. B. Familiarity with parole evidence. C. Recall of rule against perpetuities. D. Interpretation of merger. 13. A faculty member incorporates environmental law into land use planning modules. This highlights A. Regulatory integration. B. Judicial overreach. C. Equitable conversion. D. Leasehold conveyance. 14. In a simulated eviction proceeding, which skill is most critical for student success? A. Due process advocacy. B. Abstract reasoning. C. Title theory knowledge. D. Chain of title memorization. 15. A professor evaluates a student's explanation of the Fair Housing Act in relation to discriminatory zoning. This assessment focuses on A. Regulatory compliance and communication. B. Fee-tail clarity. C. Legal citation. D. Statutory dating. 16. Teaching fee simple subject to condition subsequent can be reinforced with A. Conditional use permit cases. B. Warranty deed drafting. C. Future interest diagrams. D. Lease acceleration examples. 17. A property instructor requires students to develop rubrics for evaluating peer case briefs. This builds A. Metacognitive skills. B. Avoidant behavior. C. Memorization endurance. D. Visual repetition. 18. In a peer-led seminar, students compare the doctrine of equitable conversion with legal title transfer. This encourages A. Abstract concept synthesis. B. Fact pattern replication. C. Statutory definition recall. D. Minimal engagement. 19. Which adult learning strategy best supports long-term retention in a module on servitudes? A. Spiral learning using case revisits. B. High-speed recall quizzes. C. Casebook-only reading. D. Single-day immersion. 20. When a student questions the legitimacy of a right of reentry clause, the instructor should A. Use Socratic questioning to deepen understanding. B. Directly assign a statute. C. Avoid the topic. D. Provide rote definitions. 21. A professor asks students to evaluate conflicting title documents. What evaluation method best fits this task? A. Case file simulation. B. Multiple choice exam. C. Oral pop quiz. D. Fill in the blank worksheet. 22. Students role-play city planners in a zoning workshop. This learning activity promotes A. Interdisciplinary problem solving. B. Passive observation. C. Memorization. D. Isolated law review. 23. When examining leasehold interests, a mentor emphasizes the key difference between periodic tenancy and tenancy at will. This fosters A. Legal precision. B. Legislative drafting. C. Overgeneralization. D. Procedural evasion. 24. A mentor challenges students to interpret ambiguous land descriptions in deeds. This supports A. Analytical reading skills. B. Abstract property theory. C. Summary judgment skills. D. Memorization drills. 25. What principle must be prioritized when mentoring students on foreclosure defense? A. Equitable redemption. B. Warranty liability. C. Legal remainders. D. Fee-tail limitations. 26. To align with adult learning theory, a professor introduces a flipped classroom module on recording acts. Students first. A. Watch case videos and analyze statutes at home. B. Memorize vocabulary lists. C. Complete timed quizzes. D. Recite doctrine in class. 27. Instructors teaching future interests should use which curriculum tool for clarity? A. Visual flowcharts of interests. B. Audio lectures only. C. Black-letter lists. D. Case citations without context. 28. Students conduct due diligence for a hypothetical land purchase. This helps them develop A. Transactional competency. B. Oral advocacy. C. Citation management. D. Rule memorization. 29. A peer review exercise in property law class focuses on evaluating drafts of real estate contracts. This practice supports A. Reflective communication. B. Instructor dominance. C. Objective memorization. D. Redundant notation. 30. A professor gives a scenario about a landowner fencing in a neighbor's property. What property principle is most applicable? A. Encroachment and adverse possession. B. Constructive eviction. C. Joint tenancy severance. D. Public use doctrine. 31. A mentor introduces a scenario involving a profit-à-prendre dispute. What instructional method best fosters legal understanding? A. Case analysis discussion. B. Dictation of definitions. C. Lecture-only delivery. D. Memorization game. 32. When designing an assessment on title insurance, what evaluation method best suits adult learners? A. Client advisory memo. B. Multiple choice quiz. C. Oral recitation. D. Timed matching activity. 33. A professor leads a simulation where students resolve a dispute between dominant and servient estate owners. This method encourages A. Critical reasoning and communication. B. Memorization of case names. C. Passive observation. D. Statutory fill-ins. 34. In a title transfer clinic, students prepare a quitclaim deed. What skill is most directly supported? A. Transactional drafting. B. Statutory recitation. C. Judicial research. D. Precedent recall. 35. To enhance regulatory compliance knowledge in housing law, instructors should incorporate A. Local code comparisons. B. Textbook-only study. C. Closed-book tests. D. Weekly outlines. 36. A student proposes reforming recording systems. The professor encourages A. Policy critique and synthesis. B. Doctrinal focus only. C. Memorization of common law. D. Simplification of facts. 37. In a property litigation seminar, a mock trial is held regarding a boundary dispute. This best builds A. Advocacy and evidentiary analysis. B. Casebook familiarity. C. Note-taking precision. D. Citation memorization. 38. Students evaluate the role of nuisance law in urban development. The most appropriate activity is A. Land use planning simulation. B. Rule listing quiz. C. Lecture rewatch. D. Spelling test. 39. A professor challenges students to identify latent versus patent defects in property sales. This develops A. Risk identification skills. B. Historical analysis. C. Moot court techniques. D. Lecture transcription. 40. When teaching the doctrine of waste, instructors should focus on A. Tenant obligations in property preservation. B. Easement appurtenance rules. C. Leasehold duration. D. Nuisance balancing. 41. Students analyze whether a zoning regulation constitutes a regulatory taking. Which method fosters deep learning? A. Case comparison with state precedents. B. Lecture slides only. C. Review of historic statutes. D. Syllabus outline. 42. To develop mentoring skills, a professor has students coach peers on mortgage acceleration clauses. This promotes A. Peer-to-peer instruction and analysis. B. Textbook reliance. C. Passive knowledge intake. D. Lecture repetition. 43. A professor teaches rule against perpetuities using animations and flowcharts. This addresses A. Visual learning needs. B. Legal citation fluency. C. Judicial trend recognition. D. Text comprehension only. 44. Students are asked to audit land use plans for a hypothetical city. This develops A. Real-world application and regulatory review. B. Legal definition accuracy. C. Syllabus adherence. D. Judicial memo writing. 45. A mentor assigns a project to review tax lien statutes by jurisdiction. This reinforces A. Regulatory diversity understanding. B. Oral advocacy. C. Leasehold classifications. D. Appurtenant relationships. 46. In a case of tenancy in common, a student must resolve a conflict over improvements. What skill does this build? A. Equity and contribution analysis. B. Fee-tail identification. C. Easement formation. D. Title theory memorization. 47. A professor asks students to simulate a judicial foreclosure proceeding. The primary focus is A. Due process and statutory compliance. B. Bailment contracts. C. License revocation. D. Police powers. 48. A faculty-led review session uses student-generated hypotheticals. This enhances A. Ownership of learning and creativity. B. Passive reading habits. C. Case briefing only. D. Faculty-dominated instruction. 49. A property law mentor evaluates students' mock client interviews. This supports which skill? A. Legal communication and professionalism. B. Statute memorization. C. Textbook comprehension. D. Property diagramming. 50. When teaching tenancy structures, instructors provide a flowchart showing transitions. This supports A. Sequential logic and retention. B. Redundant recitation. C. Multiple choice prep. D. Memory fatigue. 51. A student presents a regulatory comparison of local and federal fair housing laws. The instructor is emphasizing A. Integrated compliance analysis. B. Statutory word count. C. Lecture note-taking. D. Text review. 52. A professor assigns students to research zoning exceptions. The most valuable learning outcome is A. Understanding of local variance procedures. B. Citation repetition. C. Rule memorization. D. Court opinion review. 53. In a bar prep session, students conduct a deed chain review. This fosters A. Detail orientation and analytical mapping. B. Passive note checking. C. Code recitation. D. Visual disinterest. 54. A professor models a negotiation between a landlord and tenant. The goal is to reinforce A. Real-time legal strategy. B. Moot court decorum. C. Passive absorption. D. Leasehold vocabulary. 55. Students draft eviction notices based on provided facts. This task develops A. Precision in legal writing. B. Jurisdictional spelling accuracy. C. Rule of law debates. D. Historical analysis. 56. To measure understanding of equitable servitudes, instructors assign A. A dispute resolution exercise. B. A legal crossword. C. Textbook outlines. D. Dictation of law. 57. When analyzing a deed with ambiguous terms, students should apply A. Rules of construction. B. Adverse possession tests. C. Lease enforcement. D. Privity distinctions. 58. A peer teaching module on joint tenancy termination builds A. Mentorship and leadership development. B. Rote learning habits. C. Silent comprehension. D. Memorization anxiety. 59. A professor asks students to review eviction protections during emergencies. This applies A. Evolving legal standards. B. Statutory default. C. Fee simple conversion. D. Ad valorem taxation. 60. A curriculum segment includes development disputes over wetland designation. Students are learning A. Land use regulation and environmental impact. B. Title insurance policy gaps. C. Nuisance definition history. D. Recording statute priority. 61. In a clinical exercise, students review lease clauses for unconscionability. This fosters A. Ethical and legal scrutiny. B. Textbook recitation. C. Fee-tail analysis. D. Jurisdictional trivia. 62. A professor assigns a comparative chart of title recording systems. This builds A. Structural comprehension. B. Memory repetition. C. Legal fiction. D. Quiet title logic. 63. When teaching the impact of zoning overlays, which learning strategy is most effective? A. GIS-based simulation. B. Multiple choice quiz. C. Lecture repetition. D. Rule recitation. 64. A student-led session evaluates landlocked property and easement by necessity. This promotes A. Peer-driven analysis. B. Doctrinal ambiguity. C. Repetitive review. D. Case memorization. 65. A professor creates a scenario involving a license revocation dispute. Which teaching outcome is prioritized? A. Understanding revocability and notice. B. Warranty deed execution. C. Fee-tail dynamics. D. Joint tenancy formalities. 66. In a project reviewing eminent domain abuses, students propose reforms. This integrates A. Policy critique and innovation. B. Doctrinal recall only. C. Passive learning. D. Textbook paraphrasing. 67. A simulated client intake regarding mortgage prepayment penalties develops a real-world communication and risk evaluation. B. Case briefing. C. Quiz-based knowledge. D. Rote note copying. 68. A property mentor has students prepare presentations on covenants running with the land. This supports a verbal articulation and synthesis. B. Passive note distribution. C. Fill-in answer drills. D. Terminology listing. 69. A professor assigns role-play of a public hearing on zoning changes. This promotes a legal advocacy and community interaction. B. Statute copying. C. Quiet reading sessions. D. Memorization assessment. 70. In a lease-to-own case, students analyze equitable interests. This teaches a contract property intersection. B. Subrogation theory. C. Race notice misapplication. D. License expiration. 71. A class debate on adverse possession time periods encourages a jurisdictional analysis. B. Rule memorization. C. Terminology practice. D. Linear recall.
72. A student completes a land trust structuring exercise. The learning outcome is a. Beneficiary and trustee role comprehension. B. Boundary drawing. C. Encroachment defense. D. Reverter analysis. 73. Faculty assess understanding of marketable title by having students identify defects. This builds a. Transactional foresight. B. Quiet title focus. C. Easement memorization. D. Equitable waste issues.
74. A professor discusses tenant duties in abandoned properties. This supports a. Duty of mitigation awareness. B. Profit à prendre knowledge. C. Warranty exclusion. D. Fee-tail enforcement. 75. In a case simulation, students argue nuisance versus trespass. This fosters a. Substantive legal comparison. B. Lease term clarity. C. Wrap simplification. D. Statute listing. 76. A flipped classroom uses home videos to prepare students on mortgage foreclosure. In class, they a. Simulate defense strategies. B. Recite mortgage forms. C. Outline foreclosure types. D. Memorize statutory periods. 77. A professor requires research on minority land access policies. This enhances a. Equity and inclusion analysis. B. Lien priority recall. C. Trespass checklist use. D. Deed restriction history. 78. Instructors teach statutory periods for title acquisition through a timeline project. This strengthens a. Chronological legal reasoning. B. Static review. C. Lecture note replication. D. Memorization isolation. 79. When students critique land use ordinances for vagueness, they are building a. Constitutional interpretation skills. B. Deed classification. C. Fee simple evaluation. D. Tenancy scope. 80. A professor uses a mock rezoning petition to assess legal writing. This prioritizes a. Procedural and persuasive communication. B. Element listing. C. Statute citation memory. D. Survey data reading. 81. A peer mentor group leads a walkthrough of boundary survey interpretation. This models A. Mentorship in practice. B. Case matching. C. Timeline labeling. D. Legal guessing. 82. In a simulated home sale, students draft contingencies. This promotes A. Risk allocation and planning. B. Deed form memory. C. Equitable title identification. D. Statutory adherence. 83. A student writes a memo on quiet title actions. The instructor is assessing A. Clarity in claim resolution. B. Passive comprehension. C. Judgment enforcement. D. Fee tail creation. 84. A class project mapping subdivision covenants supports A. Legal geography and restriction analysis. B. Mortgage recording fluency. C. Environmental torts. D. Easement types. 85. A debate on the constitutionality of regulatory takings teaches A. Balancing governmental authority with property rights. B. Landlord retaliation laws. C. Constructive eviction steps. D. Market lease norms. 86. A student group reviews fraud in deed execution. The learning objective is A. Signature validity and legal remedies. B. Lease recording priority. C. Mortgage theory. D. Land sale clauses. 87. Faculty assigns students to write zoning opinions. The activity builds A. Professional judgment and policy application. B. Checklists of variances. C. Case law quotes. D. Fill-in-the-blank tests. 88. A professor tests recording statute understanding using conflicting deeds. This supports A. Priority rules and statutory application. B. Fee simple logic. C. Oral presentation. D. Lease interest division. 89. Students compare tenancy in common and joint tenancy in a mock probate. This builds A. Survivorship versus partition knowledge. B. Easement balance. C. Quiet title elements. D. Reverter clauses. 90. A professor hosts a workshop on real estate transaction flow. Students gain A. Procedural and sequential mastery. B. Surveying experience. C. Construction permit drafting. D. Non-possessory interest recall. 91. Faculty facilitate negotiation over lease modifications. The objective is to A. Practice legal communication and compromise. B. Learn lease form types. C. Repeat definitions. D. Review title search logs. 92. A clinical case involving lien foreclosure allows students to practice A. Statutory compliance and court procedure. B. Case briefing. C. Deed interpretation. D. Trespass remedy. 93. A student creates a guide on zoning appeal rights. The outcome emphasizes A. Accessibility of legal process. B. Leasehold compliance. C. Rule against perpetuities. D. Servitude hierarchy. 94. Instructors assign a chart distinguishing legal and equitable interests. This visual aid supports A. Doctrinal clarity and application. B. Surveying map use. C. Legalese reduction. D. Rote rule learning. 95. A student argues against a variance in class. The faculty evaluates A. Logic and application of zoning standards. B. Marketability of title. C. Delivery of deeds. D. Rights of re-entry. 96. A peer group resolves a race notice conflict. This activity encourages A. Statutory logic and group reasoning. B. Flashcard testing. C. Lecture-only review. D. Independent research. 97. When teaching appurtenant versus engross easements, instructors should use A. Diagram-based problem sets. B. Fill-in lists. C. Vocabulary sheets. D. Property tax forms. 98. In an oral final, a student defends a prescriptive easement claim. This tests A. Articulation and legal reasoning. B. Leasehold ranking. C. Reverter defenses. D. Writ of possession. 99. Students design a mentoring plan for new clinic enrollees covering title searches. This builds A. Leadership and instructional design. B. Survey recording. C. Filing methods. D. Doctrinal trivia. 100. A core segment on co-tenancy exits includes group projects. The focus is on A. Partition actions and equity. B. Eviction procedures. C. Deed rejection. D. Easement extinguishment. 101. A student team conducts a mock closing for a residential sale. The primary instructional goal is A. Mastery of real estate transaction procedures. B. Case law memorization. C. RAP identification. D. Adverse possession review. 102. A mentoring session reviews breach of lease remedies. This session reinforces A. Legal consequences and tenant rights. B. Rule statement accuracy. C. Mortgage hierarchy. D. Zoning classification. 103. A professor designs a module where students track the transfer of a life estate and remainders. The key learning objective is A. Understanding future interest sequencing. B. Surveying technique. C. Easement hierarchy. D. Landlord-tenant regulations. 104. Students are tasked with writing a grant of easement. This assignment promotes A. Drafting precision and legal clarity. B. Historical review. C. Judicial discretion. D. Quiz practice. 105. In a clinic setting, students counsel a client on quiet title actions. This builds A. Legal interviewing and procedural advising skills. B. Fee-tail concept recall. C. Sublease mechanics. D. Lien waiver forms.
Bar Exam Intellectual Property Law Test. The Bar Exam Intellectual Property Law Test assesses a candidate's ability to identify, interpret, and apply legal doctrines related to the protection of creative and commercial works. It covers key areas such as copyright, trademark, patent, and trade secret law, focusing on both statutory and case law foundations. Test takers must analyse legal issues involving originality, infringement, fair use, registration, and enforcement of rights. The exam emphasises practical problem-solving, critical reasoning, and regulatory compliance in scenarios such as product development, brand protection, and innovation disputes. Designed to reflect real-world legal challenges, the test evaluates an individual's readiness to advise clients, litigate disputes, and navigate the complex intersection of intellectual property and commerce. Here are the top 5 beneficial uses of the sample exam. 1. Assessment of legal competency. The intellectual property law test ensures candidates can effectively interpret and apply legal standards across copyrights, trademarks, patents, and trade secrets, validating readiness for legal practice in innovation-driven fields. 2. Client advisory preparedness. By requiring analysis of infringement, licensing, and registration scenarios, the test prepares future attorneys to counsel clients on protecting and enforcing IP rights in commercial and creative contexts. 3. Development of analytical precision. Through complex hypotheticals and statutory interpretation, the exam sharpens critical thinking and reasoning skills essential for navigating high-stakes legal and regulatory environments. 4. Support for specialization in IP law. The test acts as a foundational stepping stone for those pursuing careers in intellectual property litigation, transactional IP work, or regulatory policy. Promotion of innovation protection. It cultivates legal professionals capable of safeguarding intellectual property, encouraging innovation, creative output, and economic development through proper legal frameworks